Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your weekly deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Rick Spair, and joining me as always is Laura.
Thanks, Rick. I am genuinely excited about today's topic because it sits right at the unglamorous plumbing layer of artificial intelligence. The part nobody tweets about, but everybody secretly depends on every single day.
That is a great way to frame it, and the story we are unpacking today comes out of Google Research, an algorithm with the slightly aggressive name TurboQuant that was presented at the ICLR conference this year.
Right, and before anyone tunes out thinking this is too technical, let me promise you that this one quietly changes the economics of running large language models, which touches the cost of basically every AI product you use.
So let's start at the foundation, because I think a lot of listeners hear the phrase KV cache thrown around and have no real intuition for what it is or why it matters so much.
Happy to break it down because the KV cache, which stands for key value cache, is essentially the model's short-term memory of the conversation it is currently having with you in real time.
So when I'm chatting with a model and it remembers everything I said 3 paragraphs ago, that running memory of the whole exchange is physically sitting somewhere in expensive hardware. Is that the idea?
Exactly that. And here is the catch that makes engineers lose sleep, because the size of that cache grows linearly with the length of the conversation. So longer context means dramatically more memory consumed.
And memory on these high-end accelerators is not cheap real estate. So I imagine when you start talking about very long documents or extended chats, the numbers get genuinely uncomfortable pretty fast.
They get brutal, and the concrete example from the research really lands this point. Because a 70 billion parameter model handling a 128,000 token context can burn through roughly 40 gigabytes of memory just for the cache.
40 gigabytes is staggering when you remember that is on top of the model weights themselves, which already consume a huge chunk of whatever card you happen to be running everything on.
Precisely. And that is the squeeze. Because if your accelerator only has 20 gigabytes of headroom left after loading the weights, you literally cannot serve that single long context request without falling over.
So this is not some abstract efficiency nicety. This is the actual wall that stops companies from offering long context features affordably or forces them to throw enormous amounts of hardware at the problem instead.
That is the heart of it, and this is exactly where TurboQuant walks in with a frankly audacious claim, which is that you can shrink that cache down to about 3 bits per coordinate.
Now help me appreciate that number, because 3 bits per coordinate sounds aggressive, but for someone who does not live in compression land, what does that compression ratio actually translate to in plain terms?
In plain terms, it means at least a 6 times reduction in memory. So that 40 gigabyte monster cache I mentioned earlier collapses down to under 7 gigabytes, which suddenly fits with room to spare.
And presumably that is not just about fitting in memory, because if you are moving far less data around, there should be a real speed benefit to the whole attention computation as well.
You read my mind, because they report up to 8 times faster attention computation on NVIDIA's H100 chips, which means you are saving money on memory and getting throughput gains simultaneously.
Okay, that combination is the holy grail, but I have been around long enough to be skeptical, because usually when you squeeze something this hard, the quality of the output quietly degrades somewhere downstream.
That is the right instinct, and it is exactly the objection the researchers anticipated, which is why the headline they are pushing is near zero accuracy loss despite this genuinely extreme level of compression.
Near zero accuracy loss at 6 times compression honestly sounds too good to be true. So I want to understand the trick, because there has to be some clever insight making this possible.
There is, and it comes in 2 stages with their own names, so let me walk through both, starting with the first piece, which they call polar quant, a rotation-based coordinate transform.
A rotation-based transform, okay, but explain the intuition there, because rotating numbers around does not obviously sound like the kind of thing that saves you a bunch of precious memory.
The intuition is beautiful, actually, because the problem with raw vectors is that some coordinates carry wildly more variance than others. So a naive quantization wastes bits on the calm parts and crushes the important ones.
So by rotating the vector first, you are essentially redistributing that variance more evenly across all the coordinates. So every bit you spend is pulling roughly equal weight in the representation.
Exactly right. And the elegant part is that this rotation is data oblivious, meaning it uses a random rotation matrix with no learned parameters. So you do not need to train anything to make it work.
That data oblivious property feels underrated to me because it means you are not tied to a specific model or data set. You can just apply this transform universally without an expensive calibration step beforehand.
It is hugely underrated. And that is the practical magic, because there is no fine-tuning, no calibration data, and no retraining required. You simply bolt it onto any model at inference time, and it works.
So that is stage one, the polar quant rotation that flattens out the variance. But you mentioned there is a second piece. So what is the job of that second component in the pipeline?
The second piece is a one-bit correction step they call QJL, which stands for Quantized Johnson-Linden-Strauss. And its job is to act as an error corrector that cleans up the residual approximation mistakes.
Johnson-Linden-Strauss, that is a name from the world of dimensionality reduction, if I remember correctly. So they are borrowing a classic mathematical result and repurposing it as a precision cleanup layer here.
That is exactly what they are doing, using a random matrix derived from that famous lemma to shave down the error in the attention computation, squeezing out extra quality without spending many additional bits.
And when you combine those two stages, the rotation plus the correction, the researchers make a fairly bold theoretical claim about how close this gets to the absolute mathematical best you could ever do.
They do, and this is the part that makes information theory nerds genuinely excited, because they show the method operates within a factor of roughly 2.7 of the information theoretic limit.
Help our listeners appreciate why that bound matters, because saying you are within 2.7 times of optimal might sound loose. But in this corner of mathematics that is actually remarkably tight.
It matters because the information theoretic limit is a hard wall, the theoretical floor on how few bits any method could possibly use. So getting that close with a training-free approach is genuinely impressive.
Now, I want to play devil's advocate for a moment, because whenever a result looks this clean, the independent community usually pokes at it and finds the messy reality lurking underneath the polished claims.
And right on cue, that is exactly what happened, because some independent evaluations found that the one-bit QJL correction can actually add variance that the softmax function then amplifies, hurting attention quality at very low bit settings.
So the very component that is supposed to clean up errors might, in certain aggressive regimes, be introducing new noise instead, which is a wonderfully ironic twist on the whole elegant two-stage story.
It is deliciously ironic. And the practical takeaway from those critics is that at the most aggressive compression ratios, you might actually be better off disabling the QJL step entirely and leaning on polar quant alone.
That nuance is important because it reminds us that benchmark headlines and real-world deployment are two different animals. And the engineers actually shipping this will need to tune it carefully for their own workloads.
Completely agree, and yet even with that caveat, the core achievement stands, because shrinking the cache 6 times while staying training-free is the kind of result that ripples outward across the entire ecosystem.
Before we get to the ripples, I want to situate this against the past, because quantization is not a brand new idea. So what makes this approach meaningfully different from older compression tricks?
Great question, because earlier methods often needed calibration data or careful per-model tuning to avoid wrecking quality, whereas the whole pitch of this work is that it sidesteps all of that learned machinery.
So the older generation of techniques essentially required you to babysit each deployment, measuring statistics on your specific data before you could compress safely, which is exactly the kind of friction that slows real adoption.
Precisely. And that friction is why so many promising compression papers never escape the lab. Because the moment a method demands calibration runs and model-specific tuning, the engineering cost often outweighs the memory savings in practice.
That makes me think about the edge and on-device angle too, because if you can shrink the cache this aggressively without any calibration, suddenly running longer contexts on phones or laptops starts to look plausible.
That is a tantalizing direction, because the memory ceiling on consumer devices is brutally low. So, any technique that cuts the cache footprint by 6 times directly translates into longer conversations on hardware people already own.
Let's talk about those ripples, because I think the most exciting thing here is not the algorithm itself, but what it unlocks once it is widely available to people who are not Google.
That is the real story, and the speed of adoption tells you everything. Because within weeks of the paper, there were already multiple open source implementations, including PyTorch versions and ports targeting the popular llama.cpp runtime.
That community velocity is striking because it means a hobbyist running models on a single consumer card at home suddenly gets access to the same memory tricks that the big labs are deploying at scale.
Exactly, and that democratization is the part that gets me excited. Because long context has been this premium feature gated behind expensive hardware, and techniques like this start dissolving that barrier for everyone, not just well-funded companies.
It also has interesting implications for cost at the provider level, because if every served request consumes a fraction of the memory it used to, you can pack far more users onto the same fleet.
That is the quiet economic earthquake, because inference cost is the dominant expense for anyone running an AI product at scale. So a 6 times memory win flows straight into either fatter margins or cheaper prices.
And cheaper prices or higher capacity tend to unlock entirely new use cases, the kind of long document analysis or persistent memory applications that simply were not economically viable when the cache was eating 40 gigabytes.
Right? And I think that is the broader lesson of this whole TurboQuant story, that some of the most consequential progress in AI is happening not in flashy new models, but in the boring efficiency layer underneath.
I love that framing because it is easy to get swept up in the model release headlines, but the unglamorous work of making inference cheaper is arguably what determines who actually gets to use this technology.
Couldn't have said it better, and my honest takeaway is to watch this space closely. Because compression and quantization research has gone from a niche backwater to one of the most strategically important corners of the field.
That feels like the perfect note to land on, a reminder that the plumbing matters just as much as the architecture, and that efficiency breakthroughs deserve every bit as much attention as the shiny new capabilities.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, if you take one thing away today, let it be that the next time a model handles your enormous document effortlessly, there is probably some clever compression trick quietly making it possible.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.